Hello, my name is Ed, and welcome to the Rock Gut Review. Today we're doing another Best Whiskeys for Beginners video. But this is a very, very special Best Whiskeys for Beginner video. Why is that? Well, because it's about my favorite kind of whiskey, rye whiskey. So if you're not familiar with this spicy little beast, get ready, because I'm about to tell you everything you need to know to start drinking rye whiskey. Let's go. So like I said, rye whiskey is my absolute favorite kind of whiskey. Bar none. Bar none. I love rye. And rye whiskey has a wonderful, rich history, especially here in North America, but also around the world. Unlike Scotch or bourbon or Irish whiskey, you can make rye anywhere in the world. There's ryes from Canada, the United States, even back in the old country in Ireland and Scotland. Now, of course, rye whiskey is most often associated with those first two, Canada and the USA. And right now, rye is going through a renaissance, or a rye-naissance. Because just like other kinds of whiskey, rye has seen its fortunes rise and fall and rise again. You see what I did there? Like rise. Double pun! The history of rye whiskey in North America actually dates back to the colonial period. Much like other styles of whiskey, it was brought over by immigrants. But while we usually associate whiskey making with Scots-Irish people here in America, the people who had the biggest influence on rye whiskey were actually German and Dutch. Now, certainly there is a history of distilling with rye in Ireland and Scotland. However, the big grain there was always malted barley. But in the somewhat colder temperatures of northern Germany and the Netherlands, rye is the grain that grew best. So when immigrants from those countries came over, they brought their style of schnapps distilled from rye with them. Now, the schnapps they were making in the old country were not the super excessively sweet liqueurs that we Americans associate with the word schnapps today. Back in the old country, schnapps just meant a distilled beverage, much like eau de vie in France or aguardiente in Spain. One of the first whiskeys actually distilled in America around 1640 was actually distilled in the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, what is today New York.
Even old New York was once New Amsterdam.
There were many famous distillers who were of Germanic descent, people like Overholt, Schenk, and somebody named Beam. I don't know who that is. They're probably not important. And the temperature and climate of the eastern seaboard, particularly the northeast of America, and certainly the climate of Canada, was excellent for the growing of rye grain. It's a little bit colder, it's not as temperate. So farmers in these areas would grow rye grain, and whatever they couldn't sell, they would distill. It was a great way not to waste any grain, and you could exchange whiskey for other goods. So while bourbon, or at least a early version of bourbon, was being distilled down in Kentucky out of corn, the eastern seaboard and the northern area was making rye. And two of the biggest kinds of rye were Monongahela and Maryland rye. Now, both of these styles did use some corn in the mash bill. It wasn't always 100% rye. However, Monongahela rye, originating in Pennsylvania, used more rye. It was spicier, it was fruitier, it was big and punchy. Whereas the Maryland rye style tended to be a little bit more easygoing, a little bit more of that corn sweetness, a little bit less pepper, but still spicy. And of course, at the same time, Canada was making rye whiskey. However, Canadian rye is a little bit different from the US version of rye. So in the American case, you have to make your rye whiskey with a minimum of 51% rye. You have to have a majority of rye in the mash bill. But in Canada, what they ended up calling rye whiskey was basically corn whiskey with some rye grain in it. That's because when they started adding rye to their common whiskey, which was wheat whiskey at the time, they realized it was nice and spicy and tasty. But they never instituted a requirement to have majority rye in the mash bill. Now, there certainly are Canadian whiskeys that meet the American definition of what rye is, and they're excellent. They make some fantastic ryes. However, in common parlance, when you hear a Canadian call whiskey rye, there's no guarantee that it's actually made with majority rye grain. But wherever it was distilled, by the late 1800s, rye was booming. More rye was being sold than bourbon. Bourbon was mostly concentrated in the American South, whereas rye was being drank all over the place. But something came along and ruined that. Can you guess what it was? I bet you can. It was goddamn Prohibition. Boo! Boo, Prohibition! Boo! By the end of Prohibition, rye whiskey had been decimated. It was practically gone. So many distilleries closed. There were really only a few distilleries left, mainly in Kentucky. So the rye brands that were still around were now being made there. But rye in America was nearly gone. Luckily, in the past couple decades, it is being rediscovered in a big way, especially by dumb hipsters like me. And while rye whiskey in America certainly has similarities to bourbon, most importantly the use of new charred oak in its aging, it is its own style. It is a spicy, peppery, punchy style of whiskey in comparison to bourbon's sweeter, more caramely style. Not to say that bourbon is bad or anything. It's great. For babies. I'm just kidding, calm down. But rye is pretty spicy. It's punchy. It's got a lot of pretty strong flavors. Flavors like dill, black licorice, cinnamon, pepper, allspice, and a lot of fruits, peaches and figs and raisins. If you're a fan of those sherried scotches, you'll probably like that last bit. So it can be a little scary to get into rye because by its very nature, it's not really a smooth drink. It's a drink that you gotta grab on and wrestle with. And that's what I love about it. It's like eating spicy food. Same thing. But for this video, I am gonna give you a few recommendations for some more easygoing ryes for you to cut your teeth on. So you don't just have to jump right into the really spicy, dilly, black licorice bombs. To start out with, let's talk about a couple Kentucky rye whiskeys. These have a little bit less rye in the mash bill, or a lot less, depending on what you're comparing them to. Now, for this video, I'm not going to get into finished ryes, ryes that have character from some other kind of spirit from being aged in that spirit's barrel. Those are a little bit different. We're just gonna stick to straight rye for today. First up is Old Forester Rye. Everybody loves this rye. I love this rye. People who don't drink rye love this rye. People adore Old Forester Rye. Now it is at 50% alcohol, 100 proof, so there is a little bit of alcohol bite. But the nice thing with that is it's great for cocktails. You can make a great Manhattan with it. And if you're drinking it neat, you don't actually get a lot of those rye notes that people get really turned off by. This is a fruitier rye. This is a little bit more of that stone fruit. And some people even say they get bubblegum off of it. Another great rye in that same vein, Nectars Rye. This is another Kentucky rye, and this guy is straight up sweet. My girlfriend Erica hates rye. Absolutely despises rye. She hates dill, and she can smell dill from a mile away. But she loves Nectars. The thing with Nectars Rye is that it is super, super caramely vanilla. If you're a bourbon drinker and you're trying to get into rye, this guy is the place to start. It shares a lot of its DNA with bourbon. It has a little bit of pepper, it has a little bit of eucalyptus, but for the most part, this is a very, very sweet, easygoing rye that's gonna ease you in to the world of rye whiskey. A similar product is Crag Rye. This guy is also pretty easygoing for a rye. It's much more caramely, much more vanilla, got some nice oakiness to it, with just a little bit of the pepper, just a little bit of allspice, just a little bit of mintiness. There's really not a lot of punchy spiciness in Crag. Now certainly that doesn't make it my favorite rye because I prefer them much more punchy and much more dry. However, I will say for Elijah that this is a step up in terms of spiciness over the Nectars and probably even the old Forester, although that's up for debate. Also, two really good budget ryes are Rittenhouse and Old Overholt. Both of these, they do have a little bit of dill, they got a little bit of pepper, but they're not gonna kill ya. And also, they're cheap. They are a fantastic value. Now, if you want to start going a little bit deeper into spice territory, but you're not quite ready to leave the caramels and the vanillas behind, New Riff is awesome. Now, unlike a lot of other Kentucky ryes, this is actually all rye. It's a 95% rye, 5% malted rye mash bill. So you would think this would be just incredibly spicy and dry and completely rip your face off. But that's really not the case. Certainly it has the rye fruit, those peachios, those fig notes. But the spiciness is actually tempered by the barrel. It's 4 years old and it was put into the barrel at a relatively low proof, and when you do that, you tend to draw out more wood sugars, and the resulting whiskey is sweeter. Another rye that a lot of people love is Templeton Rye, or, well, not this one, the base product. I only have the rum finished right now. This is a rye sourced from MGP in Indiana, and much like a lot of the ryes on this list, it's relatively sweet. I will say that it certainly does have a lot more of that vegetal sweetness, maybe a little bit more of that eucalyptus kind of taste. And I like that. The thing that gives me pause with Templeton Rye is that they add flavoring. And that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. However, under the current rules for rye whiskey, you don't have to disclose that you're adding flavoring to a rye whiskey as long as you don't label it as straight rye whiskey. And I don't really care for that. I find that a little duplicitous. For some reason, that doesn't apply to bourbon. You can never add flavoring to bourbon without disclosing it on the label. So why doesn't that work for rye? I don't know. I think somebody at the TTB was smoking crack. But speaking of MGP sourced whiskeys, Sagamore Spirit Rye. So this is a mixture of two mash bills. One, a very high rye mash bill. One, a low rye mash bill. This is meant to recreate the original Maryland style rye from pre-Prohibition. If you're a beginner to rye whiskey, I don't think you can go wrong with any of the Sagamore products, pretty much. All of them are very good. They are kind of this interesting mixture of, I guess, figgy, peppery, and sawdusty. It's a cool taste. It's a cool taste. And certainly not bone dry. You know, there's some sweetness there for those of you who aren't ready to jump into the really, really hardcore stuff. So I think this is a good way to go. All right, but I should recommend a couple of Canadian ryes. Now, this one right here is Whistlepig. And you're like, wait a minute, Whistlepig's from Vermont. Well, kinda. The Whistlepig 10-year-old is actually from Canada. It's a Canadian rye, but it does meet the definition of what an American rye should be. Now, of the Whistlepigs, I actually prefer the 6-year-old, the Whistlepig Piggyback, because it is spicier, less of that wood sugar. However, for beginners, the 10 is a nice, smooth, easy rye. Another Canadian rye to consider, J.P. Weiser's rye. Technically, it's a blended Canadian whiskey. However, I'm gonna let this slide because it says rye on the label. And despite all the silliness around the labeling of Canadian ryes, I will say this is a really good place to start. It's more of a sweet cherry vanilla thing than it is really punchy, but still got a little pepper, still got a little bit of that earthy spice. So it's a good gateway. It's a gateway drug to rye. There's a lot more ryes I would like to recommend. There are so many ryes that I think are fantastic, and if I kept talking about them all day, this video would keep going into infinity. So, people in the comments, if there's ones I've missed, which there definitely are, leave a comment below. Tell folk what rye you think are good for beginners, because I'm going to do one more recommendation. Now, this recommendation kind of flies in the face of some of the stuff I've already recommended. I've recommended stuff that is getting into spice territory, but is still pretty sweet. But this guy that I'm sipping on right now, well, it does have some sweetness, definitely goes straight into the heart of spice territory. And the reason I'm recommending it, even though it is spicy, is because it's just so damn good. It's Driftless Glen from here in Wisconsin. I think this is one of the best ryes on the market. Doesn't matter if you're getting their 51 rye, the rye with 51% rye, or you're getting their base rye, their straight rye, doesn't matter. They're awesome. Now the base rye and the 51 rye are both peppery and they have a little bit of dill. However, what I think is so cool about this is that it tastes like a Fig Newton to me. It tastes like a spicy Fig Newton. God, I love it. I love it so much. But those have been my rye recommendations, and again, please do leave yours down in the comments. I had a lot of fun making this video because, god damn it, I just love rye. So thank you for watching. Please, if you like the content, consider hitting the like button and subscribing and all of that, because I do appreciate it. And until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay rotten. Cheers.